It all began with a smell, not the smell of fire, not the moans of torture, not the denunciations or silent condemnation. A smell, piercing like rust on blood, like spoiled oil in a lamp. It rose from the floor of the refectory of St. Blaise Monastery and lingered in the corridors for a long time before it began to penetrate the prayers. The brothers, fingering their rosaries, began to cough. The abbot scraped his chest until it bled, thinking that the devil was suffocating him. But all this was the beginning of the end. Not the monastery, one man, an order, and faith. His name was Edmar. In early records, he is listed as the son of a blacksmith from Brenain, accepted into the novitiate at the age of 12. No one remembered what he looked like. His eyes seemed to avoid his face, even when he stood nearby. The strange calm with which he read the Psalms annoyed his elders. He never raised his voice, never argued, never ate meat, even on days when it was allowed. He slept on the bare stone, even though there was straw in his cell. Some said he was a saint. Others said he was mad. One old man from the convent whispered that he had seen Edmar sitting in the crypt at midnight, whispering prayers to the skulls of martyrs. Another said that he kept a page torn from the banned work of Arnulf the Nameless, the man who had been burned alive under his pillow. Everything changed when bishops from the northern provinces arrived in Avignon. Against the backdrop of war and epidemics, the papal court became wary of anyone who preached outside the rules, and Edmar began to speak. At first, only in confession, then in evening sermons. He said that the flesh was a prison, that God was not in gold and wine, but in iron, in suffering, in the renunciation of all mercy. He said that a monk should not fear death, but should wear it like a robe. And when asked who gave him the right to preach this, he replied, "I heard a voice. A voice." That one word was enough for his name to appear in the denunciations. The abbot's scribe, without lifting his pen from the parchment, wrote, "Brother Edmar claims that a voice from the wall ordered him to mortify his flesh and prepare for the iron vow." The report was sent to Avignon, to the office of the Grand Inquisitor, and from there to the secretary of Bishop Millet. 2 weeks later, a heavy convoy arrived at the monastery. No flags, no liturgy, 3 pack horses, and 2 iron chests. That same night, Brother Edmar was bound, without a cry, without a struggle. One of the brothers later testified during interrogation. He smiled. He had been waiting for this. He said, "Now I will become a sword." There was no official trial. There was only what was then called internal cleansing of the order. Edmar was stripped naked, his skin rubbed with salt so that it would better accept the metal, and he was placed in a vertical cage made of rings. At dawn, in the presence of silent notaries and 2 men in green hoods, the skin was torn from his shoulders so that the flesh touched the armor directly. The archives have preserved a letter from the chaplain who was present during the procedure. "I could not hear him scream. He did not scream. He only breathed. And with each exhalation, steam came out of his mouth like from a blacksmith's bellows. Molten wax was poured into his mouth so that he could not preach. Then they began to sew him into iron, first his legs, then his chest, and finally his skull. A specially forged half-helmet was lined with needles on the inside, supposedly to sanctify his thoughts. It took 3 days. During that time, Edmar didn't die. He was rotting inside, suffocating, vomiting blood. Servants wiped the rust from the outside of the armor every 6 hours. And all this time, he remained silent. On the 3rd evening, when he was carried out to the river, one of the guards fainted. The smell of metal and rotting skin was so strong, but he was still alive. They lowered him into the water in chains. He did not move. He only raised his eyes to the sky. A secret report to the Inquisitor is dated the same day. The vow has been fulfilled. Iron has taken flesh. Silence has been kept. Heresy has been abolished. 6 days later, fish were found downstream without scales and with eyes full of pus. A month later, No one in the monastery could enter the refectory. The smell, the same smell, rose again from under the floor. From where Edmard had prayed, the smell did not disappear, not even when the monastery walls were whitewashed with lime, not even when the floors were torn up to the clay, not even when a statue of the Virgin Mary with doves was erected over the place of torture. It remained, and with each passing day, it grew thicker. The guards who took turns at the gates began to refuse their posts. They raved at night, waking up vomiting, suffocating from the smell of rotten parchment and burnt fat. One of them, Brother Tiberius, stabbed himself in the ear with a knife, insisting that he could hear prayers through the metal. Records show that in the second week after the drowning, 8 monks in the refectory developed an unbearable, festering skin infection with oozing ulcers and blackened edges. Stripes appeared on their skin, like abrasions from iron clamps. Doctors who arrived from Avignon initially diagnosed leprosy, but ointments made from resin and dried snakeskin did not help. The wounds grew deeper. 5 died without finding peace. They were not buried in the monastery cemetery, but in a ravine. No bells were rung over their bodies. The diary of Dr. Fabricius, kept under lock and key in the Languedoc archives, reads, "They were decomposing before our eyes. I saw their skin blister and peel off in layers, but most importantly, they were whispering, 'All the same, he will return to metal.'" In the 3rd week, the refectory was locked. The windows were bricked up. The walls were sprinkled with lamb's blood. A wax-covered sign was nailed to the door, on which the abbot had written, "Here, flesh has triumphed over reason." But it was too late. At night, on the 41st day, a howl swept through the monastery. It could even be heard in the villages across the river. One of the monks, Brother Arsène, ran into the church and, gasping hysterically, rushed to the altar, shouting, "I saw him, in armor, wet as if from his mother's womb. He is standing in the refectory and praying." The next morning, the gates were thrown open. 3 members of the Avignon City Council arrived at the monastery. Rumors spread like wildfire. People said that the body of the drowned monk had floated to the surface and was now standing below, iron black, with white worms growing straight out of the visor, that his armor was now empty, and his prayer continued to sound without a tongue. The brothers' testimonies differed, but many claimed that several times during the night they heard the clanging of metal in the chapel, as if someone in armor was moving across the stone floor. The guards searched the refectory 3 times, until one of them screamed in horror and ran out, tearing his nails out. He insisted that he had seen a breastplate lying on a stone throne surrounded by skin. Then the abbot went down into the dungeons, alone, with a prayer and a crucifix. 2 days later, he was found, crucified on the wall of his own cell, with an iron nail driven into his forehead. Scratched on the floor were the words, "He is not dead, he is gone to his faith." By decision of the episcopate, the monastery was declared accursed, but they did not dare to burn it down. The building was surrounded by stakes, the windows were boarded up, and the doors were walled up. The last entry in the monastery book is dated the same day. May he be buried with God and with his armor. But blacksmiths began to disappear from the cities. 3 vanished without a trace. 2 more were found with their stomachs cut open in a church, with the words, "The vow has begun," burned into their chests. Residents claimed to hear the sound of a hammer striking iron somewhere in the slums at night. Always the same rhythm, prayerful, without pause. On the 48th day after the abbot's disappearance, a secret church council was convened in Avignon. No witnesses were called, no documents were officially signed. However, from the surviving reports of the district doctor and clerk, Etienne Chardonnay, it is known that the discussion revolved around a particularly desecrated case that threatened the decay of doctrine through fear. The wording was not disclosed publicly, but Chardonnay himself later mentioned in his personal notes, It was not a monk who returned. It was the flesh that had been given a name. By that time, rumors had already spread throughout the Provençal countryside. People claimed that at night, in flooded mines and abandoned smithies, they could hear prayers, strange, hollow, spoken through metal. Sometimes fragments of armor floated up in the river water, rusty, but as if recently worn. Inside were pieces of human skin, scraps of beard, dried teeth. One fisherman swore that he had caught a fish with a human eye. He was later found dead. His lips had been torn off, and his face was bound with iron wire. Meanwhile, in the abandoned and boarded-up monastery, strange marks began to appear. There were claw marks on the walls. On the doors, there were rust stains that reappeared every night, even on freshly scraped surfaces. One of the brothers, who decided to return to burn his notes, disappeared. 2 days later, a piece of his cassock was found at the gate, fused into a metal plate, as if the fabric had been melted together with iron in the heat. In Avignon, talk began of a second fall of faith. Several junior priests who had confessed former servants of the monastery suddenly fell ill. Their tongues began to rot from the base. One died, choking on his own blood. The doctor who performed the autopsy noted in his report, "The organs appear to have been burned from the inside. The tongue is as if boiled, but without traces of burns." The church leadership began to discuss the need for ritual neutralization of the spirit. But the bishop refused to send exorcists, stating, "There is no spirit there, only will remains." The archives contain a fragment of correspondence with the Cardinal of Toulouse. "We are not dealing with a curse. We are dealing with a vow that has been fulfilled, not by them. We did it ourselves." No reply was ever received. At the same time, mass panic began. In villages 30 kilometers from the monastery, blacksmiths began to abandon their work. One ran into a chapel at night and burned his own anvil in a fire. Another cut off his hands. A third fled to the mountains, shouting that iron calls for repentance. Children in the villages began to be born, with ashen skin and black nails. Local midwives refused to baptize them. Priests closed churches at night. The bells stopped ringing on their own, but a dull thud, like the sound of a hammer, could be heard from one bell tower. Finally, it was decided to blow up the monastery. 6 men went out. Only one remained. The gunpowder did not work. The stones did not yield. By morning, all 5 who had returned began to ooze pus. Their bodies were covered with a pattern like the stitching of chain mail. One of them was found with a metal cross growing out of his shoulder blade. The archives contain the following line: "Iron is alive. Prayer was breathed into it, and it remained." On the 49th day, the silence that enveloped the monastery was broken. In the city grammar school storeroom, cracks were noticed spreading like burns across the lower arches, right below the place where, according to old maps, there had been an underground arch connecting the monastery quarters with the smithy. Pierre, the blacksmith, was called to assess the damage, but refused to go down. He just glanced into the dark crack, took a step back, and muttered, "This isn't sediment, it's breathing." That same evening, bells rang out again in Avignon, but not church bells. It was the old battle bell of Saint Maurice, cast in the year of the Great Crusade. Its tongue had been removed and lost a century ago, but now it rang, strange, hollow, as if iron were responding to the call. The townspeople did not sleep. Mothers burned their babies' clothes so that they would not be carried off in armor. Old men prayed with their faces turned to the ground. The next day, the body of the head of the chapter was found in the bishop's residence. His face was missing, not torn out, not cut off, but as if it had evaporated. The skull was bare and shiny, but there was no blood, only the smell of burnt copper. Someone had scratched the words, "He prayed until he drowned," on his chest with a nail. He prayed until he drowned. Cardinal Seraphien, who had previously refused exorcism, disappeared on Saturday night. His office was broken into by servants in the morning. The door was melted, and the air inside smelled of iron and sweat. On the table lay a posthumous parchment, on which Seraphine's hand had written, "I saw the armor move. I heard songs woven into the seams. He did not drown. We chained him to the flesh of faith, and it did not let him go." In an attempt to stop the spread of desecration, the monastery was ordered to be surrounded with chains and covered with salt. 15 barrels were brought, but by morning they were all empty, and the salt had disappeared. The servant who was on duty that night disappeared. He was never found, but at dawn his tongue was discovered, nailed to the door of the sacristy. The tongue was dry as metal. Small scars resembling prayer marks appeared on it. The official chronicles of that time suddenly break off. None of the chancellors, copyists, or clerks left any records for the next 7 weeks. Only in the private correspondence of a notary from Orleans can the phrase be found. They no longer bury priests. They drown them in the swamps and weigh them down with iron so they won't float. The last reliable information refers to the night when, on the orders of the new cardinal, a company of armed monks arrived with fire and crosses. They entered the ruins of the monastery. None of the 50 men returned. One of the villagers later reported seeing a silhouette in full armor, standing motionless on the monastery walls at midnight, looking at the city. He did not move, but steam rose from him. Several years passed. Weeds grew on the site of the monastery, and no one approached it. The stone framing the gate turned black. Inside the former smithy, the ground swelled like a boil. People said that at night they heard a voice, not evil, not human. It was prayerful, but there was steel in it, as if the sound came from a throat bound with iron straps. The monk's body was never found. His name was erased from all archives. But in the treatise on new signs of impurity, written in 1468, there's a phrase that became a symbol of the ban. When faith is sewn together with metal, the body cannot rot, and the soul remains in chains. Thus ended an era. After this story, the rituals for executing heretics were revised. Drowning in armor was banned. Iron crosses were removed from all the monasteries of Avignon and replaced with wooden ones. Because if iron can remember a prayer, it can also resurrect a body that should not have risen.